For with our technical difficulties here. My name is Julian Chambliss. This is Rethinking the City, Sports in the City. We do Rethinking the City, of course, every month. I do it with Eliza Harris, Pat Green, uh, Peter Martinez, David Moran. Some of those people are here, some of them not. I'm a professor of urban history at Rollins College. Eliza, you want to say who you are?
Urban planner with Canyon Associates, and I'm also looking for more information about
And Pat, of course, is the most interesting man alive. He's inside. Our Rethinking in the City is actually several different things. One of them is a radio program. It's every Monday at 4 o'clock on WPRK. We have a monthly symposium. This symposium, the last Tuesday of every month, it starts at 6:30. A little behind schedule, I'm prepared for that. Our theme for this month in both the radio program and for the monthly symposium is sports in the city. Our away guest, and we typically have a guest that's away and a guest that's local. Our away guest is Dr. Rick Eckstein, who is a sociologist at Villanova University. Rick, if you want to say hey.
Hey.
Rick is a well-known expert on public financing of sports arenas. And, of course, we've had some recent excitement around sport in Orlando. I thought it would be great to have a conversation with him about his work. Rick is a full professor of sociology at Villanova. He has written a book on sports, stadium, and public financing in 2003. Has written several articles on the subject as well. So I wanted to ask Rick, could you tell us a little bit about what's drawn you to the study of sport as a sociological process?
Well, I got to tell you, Julian, when I first started studying sports stadiums with my colleague Kevin Delaney, we weren't really looking at sports. It just happened to be that sports were played in these stadiums. We're political economists, we're urban political economists, and we were looking for something interesting to show how governments subsidize corporate interests and the transfer of public resources from relatively poor people to relatively richer people. It just happened to be sports stadiums, and since that time, I've kind of taken that as a launching pad to get into sports studies more generally. But the genesis of it was sports stadiums was almost an accident, or the sports part of it was almost an accident, because you could plug in anything like convention centers or huge mega malls, getting the Olympics or other mega events, and the processes are pretty much the same.
So for you as a person who looks at sport and its impacts, what are some of the issues that define sport as a sort of public policy problem?
Well, I think it's not sports so much as a public policy problem in this context, but the stadiums themselves, these very, very expensive stadiums. However, the justification and the success of the justification for using public financing when there are so many other pressing needs in urban areas, it is really intertwined with sports and the kind of cultural mystique that sports has. And even in the face of empirical evidence that says these stadiums and sports more generally does not really generate a lot of economic development, especially in urban areas, we cling to these myths, these cultural myths, that somehow sports and somehow bringing 60,000 people together a few times a year, or in the case of a soccer stadium, maybe 19,000 people together a few times a year, how that's going to be this great catalyst for urban development. And when those economic arguments don't hold water, which is usually the case, then we dip to these more intangible arguments like building up a community's self-esteem, making, let's say in this case, Orlando feel like a major league city, like a city on the move, not a second-rate city, doesn't have to take a backseat to Jacksonville or Miami or Tampa. Right? It can be first-rate and first class because it's got now maybe a new soccer stadium for its new club.
So you get right to the heart of it. I think one of the things that made this an interesting topic for a lot of us at Rethinking the City was the possibility of some of the arguments around sport as a way to enhance the community. I think one of the things that you touched on in your comments there, and one of the things that really sort of like is a big question for some people, is how sport influences the community. A lot of research, like the ones that you do and other researchers point to, the rhetoric around jobs and culture and identity, but then there's a question around whether or not they deliver on that. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about some of the cases in other cities and what has happened in terms of sport?
Yeah, well, in terms of the stadiums themselves, in all the cities that we've studied in our book, and cities that we've studied since the book, there have been less than one cases where, or less than one case, I guess, which means zero, where a stadium, a sports stadium, has been a catalyst for significant economic development. Sometimes it'll ride the coattails of already existing development, but a stadium, or in some cases stadiums, in and of themselves don't do much. But again, as I mentioned before, the cultural rhetoric is so strong around sports, even though I think the fandom in many cities is largely exaggerated through coverage in the media and discussions among political leaders, discussions among educational institutions where schools might have a day for the Eagles or a day for the Dolphins. There are actually fewer sports fans than we probably think, but that cultural legacy is very strong. So we're able to justify spending, let's say, $500, $600, $700 million to build a sports stadium that's only going to be used maybe a couple dozen times a year, with this unending belief that it's going to generate jobs, it's going to generate goodwill in the community, it's going to lead people to move to Orlando or whatever city they're building it in. And in all the cases, it just simply doesn't deliver. But they keep going back to the well. The same politicians and the same business leaders who usually spearhead these movements, they keep going back. And even when there is public opposition, which is sometimes the case, it's fairly easily steamrolled.
Well, I know that during the debates around bringing the soccer stadium to Orlando, you were one of the experts that some of the reporters reached out to. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw in the Orlando case?
Well, the Orlando case was interesting because there is this existing stadium, the Citrus Bowl, which is basically unused, and I think some of the calls locally were to use that. However, Major League Soccer now has this model, this business model, where they insist that their new franchises have a new, publicly financed, and strictly single sports stadium, or at least soccer primary stadium, to use. And I think there were people in Orlando who were trying to get the Citrus Bowl to be a proxy for that. And I think Major League Soccer may be okay with that for a couple of years, or to have a non-new, non-publicly financed stadium for a year or two. But after that, they're really going to put the screws on. And again, the business model is that if a stadium is publicly financed, it's a little less susceptible to certain vicissitudes in the structure of Major League Soccer, which is on its third or fourth iteration right now. There have been leagues that come and leagues that go, and Major League Soccer has this business model, and part of the model is to have publicly financed stadiums to really to subsidize the costs and eventually the profits of the teams in the league.
Well, you've talked a lot about some of the problems associated with building sports stadiums. Can you think of anything that a city like ours could do to sort of mitigate some of these things that you're talking about? Are there methods or practices that we could employ that would have a more positive outcome in terms of the models that you've talked about?
Well, I think it depends on whether Major League Soccer is going to be willing to abandon this obsession they have with new stadiums. I don't know much about the Citrus Bowl physically. I know where it is. I think what here's my prediction, Julian. I think that they're going to propose a new stadium, and I've been doing some research, so be impressed at this, all right? They're going to propose a new stadium. Are you all looking to be impressed out there? I see there's at least 10 people in the audience right now, so get ready.
I'm ready for the stadium.
Right, they're gonna build. I'm gonna look at my cheat sheet here. They're gonna build a stadium at the corner, I think, of South Paramore and West Central. I think that's what they want to do in Paramore, and that would serve as a bookend with the Amway Center. And they will claim that those two bookends will generate between them. It'll be like one of those physics experiments in high school when the things zap back and forth, and the electrical bolts zap back and forth between the two globes. And it will be, they'll use the word synergy. I guarantee it. They'll use the word synergy, that these two anchors, these sports anchors, will provide a synergy. All you can do, if you don't think that's the best way to use resources, and if you want to elucidate that how these things don't work in other cities, you got to be ready with the examples, because people will they'll just ignore the reality out there unless you hammer them with it. Now, if the Citrus Bowl is in a place where, if it's in condition, and maybe people could convince Major League Soccer to use the existing stadium, that would probably be a better outcome since the team is already there. But building a new stadium is a loss for the community. It'll put a footprint in that part of Paramore, as I've been looking at it, that will just it'll just be a dead zone for all kinds of community development. It may encourage some corporate development, but it won't be good for regular folks who are trying to live their lives.
Well, I want to give you a chance to talk to some of our audience, and maybe they have some questions for you. Maybe they want to challenge some of your interpretations. So if anybody have any questions for Rick about his take on public stadiums and financing?
Wait a minute. Are people drinking beer there? Is that a beer I see on the table?
Yeah, people are. It's a beer garden.
Oh, well, listen, I got a whiskey chilling in the freezer. I didn't know that this was going to be a cocktail party. Should I go get my whiskey and we can really get down here?
I know you have an appointment. I don't want to keep you over time. So any questions?
Go ahead. All right. And you might have to translate.
Yeah.
In the research for his book, do you find a difference in the economic development for non-major markets versus major markets?
The question is, in the research that you've been doing, did you make any difference between development in non-major markets versus major markets?
Yeah, great question. What we found is that in the non-major markets, in these kind of mid-sized cities, the argument about being a major league city and being a first-rate city and not being something like that if you didn't have a new stadium or stadiums resonated much more strongly. That was a very effective argument. That argument didn't work so well in the major cities because the people there, they're already, the narrative's already there. They're a major league city. Right? Philadelphia's already a major league city. It's a big city. It's the fourth biggest city in the country. So you can't say that without a new sports stadium, it's going to become Dayton. Or it's going to become Harrisburg. So then you're forced with the major cities. Then you're forced to rely on the economic arguments, which are much weaker. And so what we found is that in the major cities, the percentage of the subsidy is usually less than in the mid-sized cities, the non-major cities, where you can make that intangible argument about what we call community self-esteem. That's a great question. Thank you.
Liza?
You said that people don't move there. Is that actually because there's a soccer game? Is that something you actually were able to measure, and how would you separate that out from other reasons people move, of which there are obviously many?
Yeah, well, when we looked at population shifts, we basically found absolutely no patterns. When we look at census data, it just doesn't matter at all whether a city builds a stadium or doesn't build a stadium. Cities like Phoenix and Denver, they weren't at all linked to when stadiums opened or not. So if there is evidence, we haven't seen it, despite people saying that it's going to cause an influx of population.
I know you don't live here, but do you get the sense that there's any chance that the stadium won't be built at this point? Like, I feel like we're already pretty far down that road. It's just a matter of how many seats it's going to have.
I don't know. I'm not privy to the day-to-day. And the Orlando Sentinel now has some kind of barrier. I can't even read the paper without paying 99 cents. Kind of drives me crazy. But I think probably it's going to happen. It almost always happens. It's very rare that it doesn't happen. You have to have, I don't know what kind of local government you have there. Is it a strong mayor or a weak mayor that you have in town in Orlando?
Very strong.
Strong mayor.
A strong mayor. Well, what you need, the only thing that you could hope for is that there's a strong mayor who takes an opposition stance, which I don't think you have there. I think the mayor is pretty much a cheerleader for this, from what I've seen. The only time that a stadium has been derailed that we can really remember is, well, there were two times, but the one important one was in Dallas, where there was a mayor who was opposed to building a new Cowboys stadium in Dallas and refused to get the gears of city government behind it. So the Cowboys had to build it 25 miles away in Arlington. But if you have a strong mayor system and that mayor is supportive, it's going to get built. I mean, you can lay down at the construction site. You can put hard hats on.
You got one more question for you?
Yeah.
I was wondering if, the thing about the stadium here is a lot of the tax money comes from the tourist development tax, which is already kind of predetermined not to be spent on some of the some of those more important issues that you mentioned before, but it focused specifically and channeled directly into tourist development, things that don't necessarily support the community, but definitely impact the larger economy. And I was wondering if you had examined any other kind of tourist-centered cities or tourist-centered states where the tax money was predeterminedly locked in like that.
Well, you know, there's no bigger tourist destination than Orlando, I keep hearing. Well, there's no city that we studied that was like Orlando, which is so much rooted in the tourist economy. But what's underlying a lot of the stadium initiatives in other cities that are not quite Orlando, but they have a big component of tourists, is that they want to become more of a tourist economy. These mid-sized cities that someone asked about before, the Pittsburghs and the Cincinnatis, they think this is going to be a way that they can increase tourism in their cities and rebuild an economy. And these are former industrial cities that are now part of the Rust Belt, and they are trying to reinvent themselves as tourist destinations. Now, Orlando's already a tourist destination, so I would be a little confused at how this is going to somehow magnify that. It's a curious argument to be made to turn Orlando into more of a tourist destination, because it's already probably one of the largest tourist destinations in the country, if not the world. Is that the argument they've been making now?
No, mine specifically about the tax money that's already has to go towards some sort of tourist infrastructure.
Well, I guess it depends on how tourism and tourist development is being defined. You can do it very widely and say it includes all sorts of things, including maybe I don't know, educational opportunities or cultural events that are not necessarily tied to sports. And if there's a specific source of the money for this tax or for this revenue pool?
Yeah.
I think the feeling is more that we're kind of cheating by using something that's a tourist tax for something that's really going to be more of a local benefit, as opposed to having to use our own local, real estate taxes.
Well, what's the source of the tourist tax, or the money that they're using?
It's tourist.
That tax
It's tourist. It's
Okay.
hotel bed tax.
Oh, so it comes from hotels, motels, rental cars, those kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's the strategy these days. In order to say to the local folks, hey, this isn't costing you anything. We're going to tax the tourists. We're going to tax the visitors. We're going to charge them 17% on their rental cars and 21% on their hotels. So if there is local opposition, I mean, what's the point? What basis do you have it on? The irony is that sometimes, and we've found this in some cities recently, is that there's a tipping point. When the tourist taxes get too high, tourists slow down. They stop coming as much to the city, and then that happened in San Diego, where they were financing the new stadium there for the Padres with a tourist tax, with a hotel tax, and then hotel visits and occupancy took a dip because it went beyond a certain tipping point, and then they ran out of money and had to dip into the local coffers, and that really upset a lot of people.
Hey, one more question for you. Oh, two more questions. Okay.
Breakeven point. So standard venture capitalism is like a 5-year return. So if you're the city, you're not a venture capitalist. So what is the time frame that you would expect to earn, maybe economically?
So the question is about the break-even point, and he's asking what is the time frame that you can expect sort of outlay associated with development of a stadium to reach a break-even point from the perspective of the city.
Well, there's only been one city that we've studied that even reached break-even, and that was Denver. Denver was able to retire the tax increase for their two new stadiums there after about 6 years. Because the growth in the Denver area was so high, and this was a sales tax that was used, an increase in the sales tax, that once the stadiums were paid for, they reduced the sales tax back to its former level. I think it's all tied to what the growth pattern is, and if they're tying this money to a tourist tax, then you would have to actually increase the number of tourists, because the other uses of the money aren't going to go down. In this case, I think it would be really tough with a tourist tax. I think it's going to be very tough for the city or the county to break even at any point, because it's already there's probably some kind of a tourist saturation that's going on in that area. There's a point of diminishing returns in Orlando with how many more tourists you could actually add to the tax rolls. Does that help at all? Is that?
Yeah, that's great.
I may have missed this at the beginning, but does he have any reference points to basketball stadium to talk to building it?
So the question is, looking at the basketball stadium, which came in about 10 years ago, do you have any sort of like sense of how that endeavor has panned out for the city as a comparison point to the possibility of this new soccer stadium?
Yeah, well, what little research I've done about, well, I guess you're talking about what's now the Amway Center, is that right?
Amway Center, exactly, yeah.
It's it's used primarily for basketball. I know there are some other things that go on there, but if you look in that area, it's basically a dead zone. There's a couple sports bars here and there, and from what I've seen when I did a little bit of field work there 2 years ago, is it hasn't had any kind of a real impact on that neighborhood, except maybe to increase the traffic for cars that are getting off of I-4 and the 408, but it hasn't stimulated people to move to that area. It hasn't stimulated development of new apartments or houses. There don't seem to be an influx of stores that people could shop in. It's a place for suburban folks to come and visit for a couple hours and then go home.
We're wrapping up. We're rapidly approaching our end of our session here. I'm gonna ask if there's one more question for Rick about sport and city and some of his research. One more question. Yeah, Tyler, one more question. No? There's a final question. Do you know anything about the development that's north of the Amway Center by the Magic? A new Magic. They just announced a new development. You probably haven't heard about this yet.
I haven't heard about it.
I will shoot you some info. Maybe we'll get you back to talk a little about this later.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I'll make a little joke here, because if anything happens north of that from the basketball team, it truly will be magic. How about that? You like that one? I don't see anyone laughing. Hey, drink that wheat beer. It looks like a wheat beer here. Huh?
People are laughing. They're crying too, but they're laughing.
Okay.
I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Rick Eckstein, please give him a round of applause. Really appreciate it. And you were right. The technology did give us a little bit of a hurdle, but you overcame it. Thanks a lot for being such a great guest.
Well, we Luddites can do that. We know how to hold a crowd even without the projector.
All right. Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you later.
Well, thanks for coming tonight. Nice to see you.
Bye.